Today at the National Press Club, Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, Sally McManus. A senior leader in the union movement, she was a key player fostering collaboration between business and workers at the government's recent Jobs and Skills Summit, while pushing for big changes to how workers negotiate with their employers. Sally McManus with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address. My name's Laura Tingle. I'm the club's president. A few weeks ago, national leaders converged in Canberra for a Jobs and Skills Summit designed to kickstart the debate about our post-COVID, post-lockdown economy. There are big questions to be answered about boosting our productivity and how we fix a once unimaginable problem of wages falling in an incredibly tight labour market. It also met to address the related and considerable long-term flaws in our workplaces and workplace relations system. The summit brought together business, union and civil society representatives to address all these issues in a spirit of cooperation. The ACTU, as the peak body of Australia's union movement, was a key player in the summit and will have a big role in how we address those issues in coming years. Sally McManus is the Secretary of the ACTU, and I'd ask you to please join me in welcoming her back to the Press Club.
Thanks so much, Laura. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Ngunnawal people, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. The Australian union movement's incredibly proud and humbled that we share this country with the oldest continuous culture in the world. The Australian union movement supports the call for a voice, treaty and truth-telling. We support the statement from the heart, and we think it's time, and we believe, to give First Nations people truth, respect and a voice. Last time I addressed the National Press Club was in December 2020. Looking back, it seems as though I thought, and I know with many others, that the worst of the pandemic was over. I reflected on how lucky we were as Australians to believe in the positive role of government, that our sense of community meant most of us agreed to actions for the common good. Of course, COVID was not over, and it's not over. And the worst back then was still to come, and the pandemic continues to play havoc, and many lives have been tragically lost. I will use this platform again to thank our frontline and essential workers for continuing to sacrifice so much. I know that there's quite a few of them here today, but you deserve so much more than thanks. One of the lessons of the last few years is that we as a country, we're better, we're stronger, and we're happier when we work together. Doing something for others, pulling together as a community, committing to something greater than yourself is the glue that held us together when the virus was at its most life-threatening. This preparedness to act as a community is a precious national resource that should be celebrated and empowered. The instinct to want to work together, to look after each other, to act for the greater good and to build community is, however, not an inevitability. It can be nurtured or it can be diminished, and the actions of political leaders, they can take us one way or they can take us another. At the last election, the Australian public affirmed that they wanted an end to the politics of division. They wanted a government that better represented the diversity of our country. Voters set a strong message of support for a different kind of representation, clearly believing that better decisions come when more voices are heard. And we've started to experience this change. The new government's Jobs and Skills Summit was a glimpse of Australia at its best. Different views and perspectives being brought together to consider what is needed for the greater good. This makes a big change from the previous government. One of the things I clearly remember about the emergency phase of the pandemic in 2020 and the almost daily meetings with the then government was nearly Every meeting was almost exclusively with men in suits. And I remember asking myself, where is everyone else? And why couldn't they see that this was a problem? It was just so stark. Nearly all the pandemic leaders and decision makers on Zoom, in the safety of their comfortable homes, making decisions for people whose lives were so different from theirs. The essential and frontline workers, people who were stood down, families suddenly without any income, and people risking their own health to go to work. The government was doing something it had not done before. It was taking advice from the representatives of these workers. It was taking advice from unions. This was a huge difference after decades of marginalising workers' voices. And apart from the occasional tripartite meeting to tick a box for an international treaty, most ministers in the federal government at the time were meeting the leaders of unions who represented workers in their portfolios for the very first time. There was no pre-existing relationships or even experience of working together outside of a crisis. I remember how surprised some in the government were at the attitude of union leaders. They were continually confounded about our responses and our commitment to work together for the common good. Some in the government even assumed we would use a crisis to organise disruption and set up a high-level rapid response group should this occur. This group was a distraction and a total waste of time, and of course it had nothing to do. It's clear that they'd come to believe their own rhetoric about us, which meant they didn't understand us at all. Fellow Australians who wanted to serve the common good and work together to save lives, jobs, and to keep people safe. It surprised me how big that gap was between reality and their imaginations. One day they thought we were Marxist ideologues looking for opportunities to cause rebellion. The next day we were secret Labor Party operatives who might leak to the media. The gap between reality and fantasy was huge, and a product of not respectfully engaging with us for so long that they come to believe their own caricatures. What a loss for our country when the perspectives of key parts of it were shut out, their ideas ignored for too long. The change in 2020, for the briefest time, benefited the whole country. The most popular act of Prime Minister Scott Morrison was to bring together the National Cabinet and to work across political lines. I reckon their most popular policy was JobKeeper, proposed by the union movement, who then helped implement it. When our country faces challenges, big or small, bringing the strengths and the perspectives of the diversity of our community together makes for better decision making, and it builds national unity. And it's not just working people, it's the full diversity of our community and the different experiences of life in Australia, across cultures and lived experience. The recent Jobs and Skills Summit could not have been more different than the normal operations of the previous government. And this is a really good thing, because the challenges ahead now for our country are significant. Continued global insecurity, the impact on our economy, on the war in Europe, attacks on democracy and the rise of autocracy, the increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people, the existential threat of climate change. Now, the Jobs and Skills Summit didn't aim to provide solutions to these enormous problems, but for those who wish their failure need to be warned. The nation heaved a sigh of relief to see the halls of Parliament House being used to create consensus and constructive discussions and not conflict. The Australian public voted for the change the Skills Summit represented. Listening, talking to each other, multiple voices, different opinions, a diversity of backgrounds and lived experience. 50% women, First Nations people, cultural diversity, different classes and backgrounds, and working people. Now, the last National Economic Summit, which brought unions and business together, was way back in 1983. And the summit consolidated the Accord, which delivered Medicare and a path to superannuation, long-lasting nation-building achievements. And I want to keep us with 1983 for a moment, because the countervailing political idea was also published that year. It was one that made its way into the heart of the Liberal Party, and it seems it's never left. And one that explains how we got to a situation where the voice of workers was locked out for so long, and how we were portrayed as caricatures so divorced from reality. We saw it in the stated reason given by the opposition leader Peter Dutton when he refused to accept the federal government's invitation to the Jobs and Skills Summit. It boiled down to this: he would not sit down with unions. He refused to sit down with unions. It's clear the opposition can find little unity or consensus on major issues affecting Australia, like climate change, like integrity, like gender equality. But there appears to be one remaining safe space for the Liberal Party, denigrating people who choose to join unions and continuing to call people who represent workers union thugs. The anti-union stance of the new opposition leader, well, it's not new and it's certainly not original. This hyper-aggression towards and the demonising of unions does have its genesis way back in 1983. In that year, Gerard Henderson, a soon-to-be staffer to John Howard, wrote an article attacking the system of cooperation between employers and unions and called for the dismantling of bodies that fostered and regulated the different interests of workers and employees. This call was taken up a few years later and became a campaign proper in a meeting organised by 4 men in Toorak. This occurred in February 1986, a meeting which led to the creation of the H.R. Nichols Society. Those 4 men in Toorak, they were John Stone, Peter Costello, Barry Purvis and Ray Evans. To quote from an article in 2007 by Michael Batchelard in The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, in Evans' words, they wanted nothing less than freedom in the labour market. Their agenda involved abolishing the commission, the award system and possibly minimum wages. If there was to be a minimum wage, it would be set very, very low. Anything above it would be agreed by bargaining in an environment very unfriendly to unions. Individual contracts would be encouraged and would take precedent over collective negotiated agreements. The heart of this campaign is a belief that employers should have free rein to decide everything, so workers' rights and any body, such as the Industrial Commission, that gets in the way must be removed. So, of course, the very existence of unions goes against their idea of absolute employer prerogative. To impose their ideological view on Australia, they had to demonise unions and union members because we would resist any attempt to weaken workers' rights. They needed to weaken the opponents of the change in every way they could, but especially in the eyes of the public, if they could succeed in reducing workers' rights and for it to be ever politically achievable. In a speech in 2014, the then Employment Minister Eric Abetz compared the call to destroy workers' rights to a moment that Martin Luther pinned his revolutionary leaflet to the door of a church, ushering in, as Mr. Abetz told the audience, the 30-year war. It's not a view that bubbled up organically from the Australian public, from social trends, or even from employers. Neither was it a natural consequence of globalisation. It was an idea born in 1983, formed into an organisation in 1986, and was pursued by elements of the Liberal Party ever since. It's their 30-year war. Nick Minchin, giving a speech to this society, the H.R. Nichols Society, in 2026 says the quiet bit out loud: the great majority of the Australian people do not support what we are doing on industrial relations. They violently disagree. Their 30-year campaign has seen work choices, many royal commissions, special legislation to target unions, the most recent still existed in 2020, and workers to target unions and workers, and relentless demonisation. And you know what? It's delivered exactly what it was designed to deliver. Falling real wages, workers not sharing in productivity gains, profound levels of job insecurity, growing and glaring income and wealth disparities, and one of the most gender segregated workforces in the OECD, a major part of our shameful equal pay gap. Campaigns by the union movement to abolish work choices and the introduction of in 2009, the Fair Work Act, it helped stem the tide, but it didn't reverse it. The legacy of the attack on unions has become starker the last decade. 10 years of wage stagnation and now dramatically declining real wages, which low unemployment, increased productivity and bumper profits are just not shifting. I've revisited 1983 and 1986. I might just say it's not because it was the last time Parramatta won the grand final. Because in coming months, we'll see the Liberal Party and some of its supporters in the business lobby press play on the old rewound cassette of the 1980s. Relentless, repetitive, ridiculous anti-union rhetoric. As we try and fix the wages crisis, job insecurity and the gender pay gap, we'll be subjected to the language of the 30-year war. Peter Dutton and Michaelia Cash will rely on the caricatures to create something scarier than people not being able to pay their bills. The old cassette player will be turned up to 11. Here are the 3 vintage tunes you can expect to hear. Firstly, the wage price spiral. Now this one's straight out of the 1970s. It's been completely disproven, but they'll still pump it up. It is clear that wage increases have absolutely nothing to do with our current inflation problem. In addition, a repeat of the 1970s is impossible because the economy is totally different and the wage system of that time has been comprehensively dismantled, impossible to recreate, and no one is even proposing its return. Secondly, the hypothetical scenarios of strikes across small mum and dad businesses. Now, this one is pure fantasy. The fact that such strikes have never occurred, in fact, such strikes have never occurred in our history, never occurred. Even when union membership was at 60% and when days lost to industrial disputes in our country was at its highest, it did not occur. It will not occur now. The truth is, the public can see the rising profits of big business and the increasingly obscene pay packets of CEOs. So some big business lobby groups will have to manufacture ridiculous scenarios regarding threats to small business because they do not want any change for themselves. Lastly, the use of the term union thug. 55% of union members in Australia are now women. The average union member is a 36-year-old nurse. She probably works at Westmead Hospital, and the largest union is her union, the ANMF. Consider how the facts are so divorced from reality. Anyone who wants to understand the union movement in 2022 has only to look at the faces of those who've actually been on strike this year. Teachers, nurses, aged care and early childhood workers. Many are young women of colour, workers who've been disrespected and underpaid. The facts and the reality are very, very different. Australia has experienced the biggest drop in living standards ever recorded. Real wages have not increased for a decade and now they're dramatically going backwards. Labour productivity has increased 13% in that time, and those gains have nearly all been banked by capital. The CEOs of Australia's top 100 listed companies had an average pay increase of 17% this year. Now they earn 134 times more than the average Australian worker. The profits for these companies have ballooned more than 53%. The truth is workers' rights need to be repaired and upgraded if wage increases are to return to where they should be. Most of us advocating this are not thugs. We are Australians who want fairness back so there's a better future for everyone. The repair to the Fair Work Act must start as a matter of urgency. This Act sought to redress the damage done by the Howard government's work choices legislation. But it was drafted before the full impact of the global financial crisis was known and before the expansion of the gig economy and other forms of work that have been used to avoid paying employee entitlements. It was introduced before wage theft became a business model and has done nothing to stem our collapse from 12th to 43rd in the world on global gender gap ratings. As work and the economy has changed, the Fair Work Act has become more complex and inflexible. It does not provide adequate mechanisms for workers to achieve fair pay increases or to improve conditions. It's not protected workers in the rapidly changing economy, and it's certainly not provided appropriate mechanisms to ensure the compliance with workers' rights. That's why we see so much wage theft. The Fair Work Act generally applies to traditional employment relationships at a time when those relationships are being undermined by labour hire, sham contracting, gig economy, and other legal relationships that reduce pay and conditions. The emphasis on enterprise-level bargaining at the expense of other forms of collective bargaining or means of regulating wages and conditions no longer delivers pay increases with productivity growth. The Act promotes one form of bargaining. It's one size fits all. In their book, The Wage Crisis Revisited, Professor Andrew Stewart, Dr. Jim Stanford and Dr. Tess Hardy show the proportion of employees covered by agreements is now down to just 15% in late 2021, and that's compared to 27% in 2012. That's an enormous drop. It's a system that's just failing workers, and quite frankly, it's failing Australia. It's overly complicated, time-consuming, and too easily gained by too many employers to drive down wages. It just needs fixing. And the changes we want are not unusual, and they're not radical. They exist in many parts of the world in growing, competitive, wealthy, very successful economies. Firstly, to tackle the wages crisis, we must make bargaining more accessible to more people and to stop wage theft. The more collective bargaining, the more pay rises and the fairer work becomes in many ways. Large parts of the bottom workforce have been effectively locked out of collective bargaining, or they face narrow, outmoded notions of productivity that have little meaning across many sectors. Think about education, health, aged care, early childhood education, disability and community care. Far from encouraging innovation and productivity, enterprise-only bargaining has too often also encouraged and rewarded a race to the bottom, with decent employers who negotiate fair agreements being undercut by businesses who will not. The current enterprise bargaining system often actually entrenches conflict and division because bargaining is drawn out for far too long with unnecessary hurdles, legal complexities and ineffective independent umpire. An absolute classic example of this is enterprise bargaining at Sydney Trains. This dispute has gone on for so long because the umpire, the Fair Work Commission, under the Fair Work Act, is mainly a bystander. They're only allowed to assist in very limited circumstances or to enact the nuclear option, cancelling agreements which only benefit one side. This bargaining dispute with claims and counterclaims, the government agreeing one day and walking away the next, shows just how broken bargaining is. It would have been resolved 6 months ago if we had a properly functioning bargaining system where the independent umpire could oversee difficult disputes with the power to guide a conclusion by ensuring everyone played by the rules. Limits on our current law on multi-employer bargaining, it also holds back cooperation. Employers in many sectors and industries face common problems, such as the underinvestment in skills and skills development, technological change, climate adaptation, and energy transition. Many employers I've spoken to actually want to work together with their workforce to find solutions to advance the future of their industries. They want to attract workers to their industry. They want people to choose their industry and to have a career and to stay. These issues can only be addressed across employers. And these are areas where employers and workers should and could work cooperatively together. And guess what? This is exactly what happens in highly productive economies in Europe, where there's multi-employer bargaining, and these issues are part of the bargaining process. It's why a recent report by Associate Professor Chris Wright from the University of Sydney into Australia's skills crisis has recommended industry-wide bargaining as a key solution to encouraging all employers in an industry to invest in developing the skills of their workforce. The self-interested scare campaign about multi-employer bargaining will not mention that this system exists in many countries with that are highly productive and successful. In fact, even in the US, the world's 7th largest economy, which happens to be the state of California, has just passed laws that allow multi-employer bargaining in the fast food industry. The other ridiculous scare campaign is about industrial action. If workers have no access to industrial action, bargaining power is reduced to almost zero. When this occurs, those who sit opposite you at a bargaining table walk into that room knowing you have no options. So pay offers are low, and they take it or leave it. No one can effectively bargain if they start with no options and the other side knows it. But having the option to take industrial action and actually taking it are two different things. A functioning bargaining system sees more bargains and fairer workplaces as a result. Let's look at the facts. Many countries that have multi-employer bargaining do not have high rates of strike action. Austria, Switzerland, Denmark, Sweden, developed nations with the right to bargain with multiple employers, strong conciliation and mediation. These countries all lost less working hours to strikes per person than Australia. Where countries have high levels of disputation, this is more to do with the behaviour of their governments towards their people, disrespecting workers, and the history and culture of political strikes in a country. Now, these facts won't matter to Michaelia Cash. She's already made wild and ridiculous claims. As previously stated, these should be seen for what they are. I believe the argument for legislative change to our broken system is overwhelming. Everyone agrees the bargaining system is broken. There must be action to stop the excessive casualisation of the workforce, to support equal pay, and to stop wage theft. Our workplace laws have simply not kept pace with the changes at work, the gaming of the system by too many employers, and 10 years of inaction have left us now with chronic problems. If we do not make change, wages will not get moving. People voted to change the government to get wages moving. This will not stop the fear campaign of the opposition. Evidence and data will not sway them. It's their 30-year war. It's become an article of faith which has not served them, and it's not served the country well. When they say there should be no modernising, there should be no change, it's because they support wage suppression continuing. They will use the old anti-union caricatures as a device so they don't have to defend their system of keeping wages low. Australia can be, and we should be, so much better than this. Now, we've seen the economic impact of the 4 men in Toorak, but the damage done to our society and the country when we are deliberately divided, when good people are demonised and denigrated, it's significant. Most union representatives are volunteers supporting others, and there's many in this room today. Many people belong to their union for protection, advice, legal support, access to professional career training and development. Others join out of a commitment to make work better and society better. This is what drives perhaps our oldest activist, Joan, who at 88 is involved in her local union group, Union Shoalhaven. Joan's still active and campaigning for better public services, supporting young workers, and she raises money for the homeless in her area. It's also the story of Theo Ceramitis, a TWU member, and the health and safety delegate who was sacked by Qantas for asking for protective equipment at the start of the pandemic when cleaning planes from countries with COVID. It's the story of Bernie Banton, who campaigned for justice until his last dying breath that was stolen from him by asbestosis while working at James Hardie, a company that knowingly put him in harm's way like they did with so many others. It's the story of the nurses in New South Wales who at the moment are campaigning for patient ratios to ensure safe standards for everyone in the community should they have to go to hospital. It's a story of building unions who got together, who cleaned up and rebuilt the houses of people affected by floods and by fires. These are the stories of ordinary Australians. Helping each other is the story of the union movement, and it's repeated out of the public eye every single day. Now, you could call this mateship, you could call it solidarity, call it whatever you like. It's called being a good community member. It's joining up, it's signing up, it's turning up. Being prepared to put yourself forward when there's a job to be done. Giving a voice to others and those in need. Acting to make life better, not just for yourself, but for others. All of these instincts make us stronger as a community and as a country. We should call time on the 30-year war of the 4 men in Toorak, which has caused ugly division and declining living standards. That song, that old cassette, it's had its time. We must now begin to correct the deep problems it's delivered for working people. We should be encouraging cooperation and supporting the work of unions. Australia can do so much better. For all those people now struggling to keep up, working 3 or 4 jobs. For all the frontline essential workers who deserve more than thanks. For the women in jobs that have been undervalued for so long. For every Australian family sitting around the kitchen table, working out what to cut back on to pay their bills. For everyone who believes that each generation should hand on something better to the next. We've got to get this job done. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sally. Lots to unpack there. Just going back to sort of historical imagery, as you did in the speech about union thugs and strikes and all those sorts of things, I thought I was interested in what you had to say about the New South Wales train strike. I mean, there are issues about gig economies and things like this, but a lot of those sectors that you're talking about that are represented by unions now are essentially in the government sector, teachers, nurses and the like. But we've had this intractable industrial dispute in New South Wales. And if you were president for the day, rather than Queen, if you were president for the day and were able to remake the industrial relations systems, can you just explain to us some of those components? You know, what would the Fair Work Commission or its successor be able to do? What would employees be able to do in this situation? What would be the demands on all the parties to the negotiations about what they would have to bring to the table?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We should set our eyes to what would be that system, what would be a system for our country that would work in a way that doesn't cause the type of drawn-out bargaining process where you can't see an end in sight that we currently see in that particular dispute. Now, I think the key thing that needs to change is we need to give the umpire their whistle back. The Fair Work Commission has had their whistle taken off them. It was one of the key things that those blokes in Toorak wanted to do. But it's just a situation where if you had a Fair Work Commission that had the power to say, listen, we are owning the document about what is being agreed here. So we've spent 3 hours negotiating. New South Wales Government, you've put your position, the unions have put your position. At the end of this, there's this agreement. Now, at the moment, what's happening is, people walk out and people aren't agreed on what was agreed in that room. Now, the Fair Work Commission, if they own that document and they pulled people up and say, hang on a minute, that is not what you agreed. What you agreed is here, and that they have the power to keep people to their word, and they could make that happen, whereas at the moment they can't. That would mean that bargaining was quicker, it would be fairer, and we would all not go through protracted disputes that we currently are. Part of the problem is the complexity of the system. So where you have an overly complex system, what happens, and I read with interest an article today in the Financial Review about Woodside. I just read it and it was just such a classic example of what's wrong. Now, Woodside obviously has the deepest pockets pretty much of any company in our country. Maybe there's a competition about that, I don't know, but they're up there. Anyway, they are dragging the unions who are trying to negotiate through every hurdle they possibly can. So it means that bargaining goes on, it should go on for a few months. Instead, that it can go on for years and years and years, because essentially the umpire doesn't have a whistle and our system's too complex. And I think that our system should be based on bringing people together and facilitating bargaining and bringing people together and facilitating good faith bargaining. So that means you don't have to stand on the sidelines if you're the independent commission. You are able to bring people back into line if they're not playing by the rules.
Andrew Tillett.
Thanks, Laura. Andrew Tillett from the Financial Review and Director here at the Press Club. Just going back to the summit, and before ahead of the summit, the ACTU and COSBOA signed an MOU. That obviously has caused subsequently some ructions within COSBOA, unhappiness over multi-employer bargaining. Some of the other employer groups have been rounding on COSBOA over it for letting that genie out of the bottle, so to speak. There's been accusations that if COSBOA did a deal with the devil in yourself, it was duped to sort of be co-opted for the ACTU agenda. I was just wondering, from your perspective, could you sort of how did you characterise those sort of talks that you had with COSBOA in that agreement? Why was it important from the ACTU's perspective to get an MOU with COSBOA? And has there been any indication from COSBOA's post-summit that it's gone cold on that agreement, or was sort of tried to change it or anything like that?
Thanks for that. Firstly, it's interesting to hear, those words. I hadn't heard them yet. Maybe they're said behind closed doors, but they are the same old caricatures. It's not understanding us and what's motivating us. And I do want to take people through this. So us and small business, so ACTU, the union movement, and small business through COSBOA went through a lot of trauma in 2020, and that was COVID. The shutdowns, a loss of jobs, working people suffered a lot, but so did small business. They suffered a lot as well. And we, for the very first time in an intense way, spent nearly 6 months talking to them, as we did the other employer groups to look at, okay, well, what were the issues that all sides had? I have to say, us ourselves had misconceptions as well around small business, COSBOA, what their motivations were, and I'm sure they did about us as well. And after living through something that was not was a terrible experience for all of us, we got to know each other better and we had respectful discussions. And those respectful discussions for us changed our perceptions. I think, and the union movement acknowledges that and understands that small business is actually our uncles, our aunties, our mothers, our fathers, our brothers, our sisters in our communities. We are the ones that are quite often doing it tough, whether it be the business owner in the small business or whether it be the worker. And so we understood there's actually a big area of common interest for us. That caused us to listen in a way that we hadn't listened before, and that was, okay, don't see them all as wage thieves, let's treat them with respect and listen to what they're actually saying. What they were actually saying is that the current awards system, which is only like 130 awards around that, they're very big general awards, and so there's a couple of them covering most small businesses, retail and in hospitality. And that because they're big and they're generic, they can't see themselves within those awards. So they find it like, where do we fit? Do we pay people here? Do we pay people there? And what they said to us is that we want to pay our workers properly, but like, we're not experts. We don't have HR departments. We don't have access to all this. We don't want to be spending money on lawyers just to pay people right. We want to do the right thing, but this is the barrier to it. And we thought long and hard about that, because for us, changing the award system is not something we were able to do or want to do, because even when we looked at it, to do so, it was impossible to do so without leaving some people worse off, which we're not going to do. We thought, well, why is it that, you know, big business doesn't have these issues? They don't have these issues because they've got bargains, because they've got their own agreements that look like them, that are sometimes named, you know, after them, where they're owned by that employer and those workers who negotiated them, well understood, talks about them, and there isn't, you know, those same issues, because, you know, everyone understands what it means, right? So I thought, well, that's what we need to try and achieve for small business. Now, small business by and large is not organised, it's not unionised. And as I explained, has never been, even when we had 60% union membership. And so it's not as if they've got a willing partner there, like negotiating things with them. And so what we offered to them, and this wasn't just in 2020, this was later on at their conference this year, before the election, I said to that conference that we would be willing to work with them to find solutions that dealt with the problems. And this was us applying our mind to their problems. And having the option about being able to bargain agreements that are multi-employer agreements which look like them. Let's just say you decided, okay, in Canberra there's going to be like a cafe multi-employer agreement, and that it just talks about cafe workers, just talks about the people that you would have employed there, doesn't talk about people who work at casinos and elsewhere. It's very, very simple and easy to use. We will be that willing partner, and that willing partner is the ACTU. This is actually an offer from us to put our resources and our time into negotiating those agreements with COSBOA if they want. Now, if those small businesses, you know, are not interested in that, well, and the workers aren't interested in it, well, things will stay as they are. This was an offer for more options to approach it that way. I do think that all the criticisms of some on this are entirely self-interested. Sometimes people want to hold up small business to say, oh, you know, these changes are terrible because what about small business? But really what they're worried about is big business and the profits of big business.
Thanks.
Angus Thompson.
Sally, thanks very much for the speech. Angus Thompson from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Just going to pandemic leave, obviously the union movement had a very successful campaign to reinstate that. Just going forward, should the government keep pandemic pay or a form of it going indefinitely forward, basically, for casuals who can't show up to work?
Yeah, so not just casuals, like all those people have run out of leave as well, and there's lots of those, especially if you've got, you know, kids and dependents, lots of people have run out of leave entirely. We campaigned for this because there was a big gap. That gap existed because of how many people we've got that don't have paid leave at all in the beginning. And then when the government brought in 2020 the fact that you had to isolate and that's a public health order and you have no option to do that, obviously we knew that some people weren't going to do that, and we can't leave people with nothing. And so those principles still remain for us. So long as governments are requiring people to isolate, that those people who are following those public health orders, in our view, and we'll continue to advocate for it, we won't change our view on this, people should be paid so that they don't lose money by doing the right thing by the public and following what the law is.
What about beyond those quarantine orders, though? Once they cease, should there be a safety net for those people?
Well, I think there's a bigger, longer discussion to be had about the issue of so many people not having sick leave. At the moment, this is our approach. We think that you've got to address the fundamentals, and the fundamentals are that too many people actually have permanent ongoing jobs. but employers are saying they're casual or gig economy or labour hire and denying them those basics. So we're talking about sick leave, but not just sick leave. We're also talking about annual leave, things like that. We don't want to see a situation we've got now for our kids where they never know what a paid holiday is, and too many people that's already the case. So very first job is a fixing job, and that's what we want to do at the moment. So that is to close all those loopholes. If there's a permanent job, you should have permanent rights, so that includes sick leave. So we think that that will reduce the number of people in this situation where they're not getting paid leave. The question then about, well, there's still going to be some people left without that, I think is a bigger discussion that we absolutely would like to have with the community on whether our current settings are correct on that. Like, do there need to be changes to the leave loading? Does there need to be other changes? Is there a pool system? There's lots of different ideas about this, and we would like to see moving into the future. One of the good things about the pandemic is hopefully people won't go to work as much when they're sick. And to take away all disincentives to stay at home should also employers hopefully now see too why it's in their interest for that to happen as well, because making everyone else sick in your workplace is not good either.
Thank you.
Could I just butt in there? There's a greater sort of health and medical question emerging about not just long COVID but repeat episodes of COVID. I was just wondering whether you're seeing any signs yet of how workplaces are coping with this or not coping with it.
Yeah, unfortunately we are. There's the evidence, medical evidence there for long COVID, but every union will know because they will have members who unfortunately have long COVID. Do also know that it's still uncertain about how long it lasts, and also about questions over whether or not there's other long-term, not yet understood consequences of getting COVID, not just once, but the multiple infections that people are going through. So I would say from our perspective, we are very alert to this, and this is something that as the science is evolving, we will be listening to what medical experts say about this, because we do not want a situation where we end up having people debilitated because we have not done the right thing, and the basic principles about people going to work and being safe must be upheld.
Thank you. Tom McElroy.
Thanks, Laura. Sally, Tom McElroy from the Financial Review. Thanks for your speech. Could you please give us more of a sense of what you're asking the federal government for on multi-employer bargaining? What are the parameters you're seeking, given that such agreements are possible already?
Yeah, really happy to do this. I know that there's been lots of requests for detail and letters that turn up to us and then turn up in the paper. And I sort of do note that the employers, in terms of detail and what they're proposing, I can reveal what they actually want and what they're proposing, and here it is. No change, there's nothing. Now, for us, how we would see a modern, workable, flexible system working is that you should design a system based on that you want bargaining to be quick, you want it to be simple, you want it to be fair, and you want it to be accessible. So those are the principles. So if I can put it into practice, workers or an employer or employers could say that they want a bargain. Then they need to tell each other that, and I think that it should also be that they tell everyone that. That should be public, that people want to bargain. Now, for most employers and workers that are in this situation, actually they just get on and do it. And we should make sure that the basis of that, those laws work for those people, right? So that means we need to make it as simple as we can. They should be able to just get on, bargain, and the next time they do anything is putting in an agreement for a final checking by the Fair Work Commission, reaching the boot test, which I can talk about. But that's how that should work. Now you say, well, there's a whole lot in between that. Well, There's a whole lot in between that actually just gets in the way at the moment, and the examples of Woodside are a very good example of that, where like hurdles that also employers have described as red tape, we'd be happy to describe that as well for us and for them, should be reduced or eliminated wherever possible, and the only things that should remain is anything that is necessary to ensure fairness, because a premise of all industrial law is that there's not an equal bargaining relationship between employers and employees. Then that's where the independent umpire comes in. So if you empowered them, gave them a whistle, and for those workers and employers who can't sort things out themselves or have trouble during bargaining, or if one side, whether it be unions or whether it be employers, acts badly or unfairly or in a way that's not reasonable, that they be pulled up. And that the Fair Work Commission's job is to facilitate bargaining and guide agreements towards to their conclusion. Now, at the conclusion, it should be a simple process of lodging an agreement. The Fair Work Commission should apply the boot test. Boot test is really important. Now, I just want to make sure people understand, this isn't that like you've got to be better off overall compared to your last agreement. It's better off overall compared to the minimum, the absolute minimum awards, like right down the bottom. So anyone that's arguing that it should be easy to get in agreements that can go under the boot is saying they want a competitive advantage over all other employers, and they essentially want to go less than what the legal minimum is, and that's why they're using bargaining. Now, we'll have no part of that, but there's parts of that applying of the boot tests that have become too technical and have become too time-consuming. So, for example, the issue of the Commission needing to look at all rosters that might or may not ever apply in a particular workplace or workplaces. And you can just imagine, if you've got to think about 24/7, how many different rosters there could possibly be. And even though those workers aren't working those rosters at the moment, make sure in the future, if they were, would they be worse off? Now, the reason why we've always worried about this is because sometimes employers have negotiated agreements, and yes, everyone was better off overall, and then once it was negotiated, they changed the roster, and then people weren't. So employers would need to say, just be honest and say, make a declaration they're not intending to change anything, and then have the safeguard that, let's say there was a total change of management, total thing that no one foresaw, and new employees are there and they were worse off, the Commission would be able to fix it, be able to order that they get paid what they should be paid so they're not worse off, and you don't overturn the whole agreement, because the big problem is that agreements have been held up and then they've been overturned over a small group of workers that were worse off. So we worked really hard actually with the BCA to work on that solution to that, and we think that that's a sensible way forward.
If we could just go back to the sort of essence of Tom's question about multi-employer bargaining. When you raised the example of cafe workers in Canberra, what are the sort of technical things that stop some of those agreements, presuming there's goodwill on both sides where employers say, actually, that'd be really good for us to we don't have those facilities to negotiate by ourselves. We'd like to do this. What are the things that are stopping them doing it, and are there particular sectors that you see that would be areas for these sorts of agreements to be more readily used?
Yeah, so it was always understood that there needed to be multi-employer bargaining, because the current Act does have options for multi-employer bargaining, and those employers who raise that are right. But they've all failed. They've all failed atrociously, and we've had 13 years to try and see if they work, and they don't. So aged care workers is like a really, really good example, and that they, like the idea that they're going to negotiate aged care by aged care centre, or for early childhood workers, or for that matter disability workers with their employer, is ridiculous, and it hasn't happened. And the avenue that was meant to be provided for them doesn't work. It doesn't work because those workers are cut out of the rights that every other worker has, like the option, not taking, but the option of taking protected action if they wanted to, and the ability to make sure that those who are making the decisions, sometimes in this case funding bodies, can be also part of that discussion. And then to be able to make something for all of those aged care workers. And that, of course, you'd want to cover the field there. You want to make sure that, like, aged care workers need pay rises. They should get pay rises, and that that should be able to come to an agreement with, you know, the employers in that area, and then lodge that, and then that applies to all aged care workers within the agreed area. Now, that doesn't have to apply everywhere else. Like, as I said before, we don't think it should be one size fits all, because, you know, not everyone's exactly in that situation. But either way, 1 in 7 people at the moment is covered by a current enterprise agreement. 1 in 7. And this is why wage increases are not happening. It's because you've got the annual wage review, which is for 25% of the workforce. The only other engine, and the main engine, is bargaining. And when that conks out, everything conks out in terms of pay rises. So the more bargaining that can happen across more areas, the better.
Nick Stewart.
There's no one here from the Murdoch media today, so can I take the opportunity of being a little bit more controversial? You've actually, the very fact that no one could be bothered turning up, doesn't that show that the 4 men meeting in Toorak, starting the Agile Nichols Society, have actually won? Since that time, there's been a continual downward spiral of wages as a proportion of money, profits of companies. Now we're looking at massive profits of companies. I mean, isn't the reality, and or equally, union membership has collapsed since that time. So haven't effectively Gerard Henderson and Nick Minchin achieved exactly what they set out to do? The fact that now we can have an ACTU Secretary here and President coming to address the National Press Club, and no one is worried about what you are going to say, because it will all be so reasonable, it will all be so intelligent, and it's actually going to be so completely responsible that no one will actually be concerned that you will be advocating for the few workers who are getting more and more exploited as time goes on.
So we've got to look at what winning looks like, because your point have the 4 men in Toorak won? I think it's an argument to say that, yes, they've got a lot of what they campaigned on way back then. And what it looks like is people can't pay the bills now. What it looks like is, for the first time in recorded history, we're handing on a worse standard of living to our kids. We are dramatically going backwards in terms of real wages. I was really struck by Professor Roscano at the recent dinner that was held during the Jobs and Skills Summit. He gave a speech at that dinner, and he warned everyone in that room the damage to the body politic to all of us when people go through not 1 year but several years of big real wage cuts, about the effect on our society, the effect on real people, because that happens. And I hope everyone in that room was listening, because we certainly are. Like, we cannot continue to go down the track of wage suppression. Where we do that, all those problems you're talking about are real. The day-to-day lives of people are real, but also the damage to our society, where on one hand people see the profits that are happening in parts of big business, they see the CEO increases, they see what's happening at their own workplaces, yet they can't get a fair pay increase, even though, especially over the last 2 years, Australians have worked their guts out. So many workers are completely exhausted for all the giving that they gave during that time. For those who had to work from home, all the changes they had to make all of that happen, all of those people who had to go and put themselves on the line during that time, the hospitals that have been overwhelmed, and then to be told that you're going to now have to suffer real wage cuts year after year. Now, if we're all in it together, and that was happening for companies, and things were going backwards, and Australia was not doing well, okay, we're all in this together, but we're not. We're not. It's workers that are going backwards. While profits are going up, CEO pay is going up. So, yes, they have got what they wanted, and what they wanted is not good for the country.
So if these are the right questions, when will we get the answers? How long do we wait?
Well, I think that we can't waste time on this. We have had a lot of discussion about what the problem is. I think we all agree what the problem is. We have to upgrade our system. We have to make sure that we get wages moving again. We have solutions that aren't just our solutions. There's solutions also put forward by the experts in this country, by those people who spend all day just studying these solutions here and overseas. They agree with what we've proposed, that modern economies do this, and those who aren't are starting to, because you need to, because the economy has changed. We don't have just big workplaces anymore. We don't have that. We have the biggest part of our economy is actually the care economy. We can't have all of those workers just locked out of pay rises forever and to have no say over their working conditions. And wherever you just don't upgrade things and you don't bring it up to current day, that's what you have. And we should not let the arguments of the past get in the way of taking us forward.
Mr. Schubert. Misha Schubert, as a Vice President of the Press Club, thanks so much for your speech, including the generationally ageing references of the cassette tape. Translate that for my kids later.
Apparently it's cool now, cassettes.
All the rage. So good. As I listened to your opening remarks about the union movement's support for the aspirations of the Uluru Statement, Voice, Treaty, Truth, I was thinking about the 1967 referendum, when Australia's most successful referendum ever to enable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be counted as citizens in their own country. And one of the ways that campaign was won was because all the institutions of Australian society at the time, unions, churches, businesses, so many others, lent their organisational heft to pulling out the yes vote for the country. So I wondered if you could elaborate a bit more about how you see the ACTU and the union movement preparing for the vote that the Prime Minister has announced an intention to pursue in the first term, what that would look like in practice and how you think that would roll out.
So that touchstone of that referendum is a really important one for us in our history, and you're right, the union movement played a really active role going out arguing in favour of that change. It's not just that though, like Wave Hill and the Gurindji, that and the Pilbara strike, two strikes led by Indigenous people are our longest strikes in the union movement's history, and so it's our history. And at that time, unions got behind those workers and went and sustained them during that. And we celebrate that every single year on the anniversary. It's an important thing for us. And there's a whole generation of leaders coming through our unions, First Nations leaders, which is a wonderful thing and about time as well. We, with Uluru, we'll take direction from our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander committee. So we've got a formal structure within the ACTU of First Nations people. That committee is made up of workers from right across the union movement. You've got everything from sparkies, miners, academics, community workers, First Nations union members. And so as the ACTU leadership, the ACTU executive, we will take direction from them, and that we've got a very important meeting coming up in about 3 weeks' time, which is our executive. I do believe they'll be presenting to us what they would like the rest of the union movement to do. So I don't want to preempt that, but I can say that if they do ask for support and for us to play that active role that we have in the past, I know we will all be there.
And the last question is from Angus Thompson again.
I think I get another go.
Hey.
Lucky me. My question is about the integrity watchdog, which is all the rage up on the hill at the moment. Given union officials could actually be subject to scrutiny under the new Integrity Commission, do you support the government move to restrict public hearings to only in exceptional circumstances, or do you find that concerning?
Look, we don't have a view on that. I know that's something that's been debated at the moment. I would say that union movement has zero tolerance for corruption. that this has been a hole in our legal system for a period of time where government officials have not been covered by the same laws, but unions are covered by, in terms of preventing that. And, you know, the fact that if you happen to be a union official, if you happen to be CEO, or if you happen to be a head of a church, that you'll be covered by it if you are involved in trying to corrupt a government official is a good thing. So obviously we support it and we have for a while, but this particular question that I know they are talking about on the Hill is something that we don't as a movement have a fixed view about.
Sneak in just another question. A lot of union heads have said that the movement is subject to too much or a lot of regulation already. I mean, is this additional burden of oversight that the movement just doesn't need?
Well, look, there's a whole act that is all about overseeing the governance of unions. It's got really, really strong powers. Some of those powers have been used in a completely politicised way, as most things were under the previous government. They had bodies that they set up that did just act in politicised ways, so the registered organisations certainly did that. For us, we don't want to reduce anything that is about corruption. What we want to make sure, though, is that one of the big problems with that Act is that it limited the democracy within unions. So it just had ridiculous things in there, or does at the moment, that, you know, my old union, and there's some people from it here, have 110 officials. Out of those 110 officials, 108 of them are volunteers, and one of them might be working in Broken Hill. Now, with such a high turnover in parts of our industries, if one person leaves, we don't sometimes even know it. But if we don't tell the commission at a certain time, you're subject to fines, you're subject to this, those things meant that some unions started changing their rules to limit the democracy because they didn't want to get caught by this politicised body. So there needs to be a balance. This is not about the issue of corruption. We're totally no tolerance for it. Just making sure that there's not the overhangs of politicised bodies that were a feature of the previous government.
Thank you.
Please thank Sally McManus.